Hi everyone, this is Judy Warner with Altium's OnTrack podcast. Thanks for joining us again. Today I have a rare treat for you, but before we get started, I'd like to invite you to please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast app or favorite us on an RSS feed. And remember, we also record this on video simultaneously, so if you want to see our sunshiny voices, you can go over to YouTube on Altium's channel and go under videos and you'll see all the podcasts recorded in video. I'd also like to invite you to connect with me on LinkedIn. I share lots of information about two engineers and PCB designers, and I'd love to connect with you there as well. And on Twitter, I'm at Altium Judy. So today I have the rare treat of inviting in one of our esteemed executives. I esteem you, Ted. So Ted Pawela is with us today. He is the COO here at Altium. And we're going to talk a lot about the direction of Altium and really kind of get a peek behind the curtain today. So I'm excited to share him with you. So Ted, welcome.
Thanks, Judy. I appreciate you having me on here, and I'm actually really excited about the podcast series that you're doing and see a lot of the feedback from people, and it's a little bit humbling to be here given the actual, the magnitude of the guests that you've had here from industry and so forth. So I'm not sure I can live up to that, but do my very best.
Well, I think you rank. We're glad to have you. So before we get started, I thought it'd be fun for the audience to know a little bit about your engineering background. So you haven't always dwelled in the halls of the executive world. You kind of came up through engineering. So tell us a little bit about your background there.
That's true. It's probably not a very prototypical upbringing into the industry and so forth, but I started I guess you'd say my engineering career back in sort of like the education space. My undergraduate degree was actually in ocean engineering. And the interesting thing I think about ocean engineering and Altium is that ocean engineering is one of those disciplines or one of those engineering fields that is multidisciplinary in nature. So it doesn't focus only on mechanical or only on physics or any given thing, but it's actually very multidisciplinary. In fact, when I think back on it, I did a thesis project that was to create an underwater acoustic transponder system, which sounds pretty fancy, but it was basically a device where you could send acoustic signals underwater to tell this device to do something. In this case, it was to release a buoy from the bottom that had a rope tied to it that might be attached to an anchor or something else you might want to recover. And that system, we had to actually design the electronics as well as the mechanical system. It all had to work underwater. So I think back on that a lot because following that, I spent a lot of time more in kind of mechanical domains. And so this, in some ways, is a homecoming for me.
Right.
To come back to be at Altium and be involved in electronics. So that was kind of the beginning. I worked in the underwater defense industry for 10 or 11 years as a real engineer, doing actual design work. And at that time, I wasn't really focused on electronics, but more in the worlds of underwater acoustics and mechanical systems and how those converge. So they're kind of different kinds of physics, different equations that you have to solve. And so I spent a lot of time trying to make those two things mathematically work together. And then from there, I actually ended up, because I was working with software, and in this case it was ANSYS software and actually Abacus software that at the time has now become Simulia over at Dassault. But I was working with those two softwares, which are simulation softwares in the mechanical world. And I was presenting at conferences and things like that, and I had the opportunity actually to join ANSYS, and I did so, and that kind of took me from that world of real hardcore engineering into the software side of the business, and I love that. And I've now been at a number of software companies, all engineering software companies, and it's become something that I have a passion for and that I really enjoy and love, and feel really fortunate to have found my way to Altium.
Well, we're glad to have you. You've definitely been a change agent here for good. And what I really love about Altium, and I think that you appreciate it like I do, is if you walk through these halls very long here at the La Jolla office, there really is a lot of people that have kind of that cross-disciplinary feel, but we really do advocate and care about the engineer, and that sounds kind of corny.
Yeah.
But I think because there are lots of people, even like myself, that were in fabrication or, where I was selling and sort of in the weeds, it makes me feel excited to come to work in the morning and to be able to advocate and to help enable sort of the next generation of technology, be part of that. So
yeah. No, I'm excited about that as well. And I think, fundamentally it comes down to this sort of basic notion that's independent of any industry, is that if you do the right thing for your customers and you really think about them, that they do good things by you as well. And so I think, we get that here from the top of the organization through to the, through and across all places in the organization. And definitely that is kind of a cultural element here that I both appreciate and, I'm kind of committed to perpetuating and extending as much as we can.
Well, a fun note here is that Ted actually hired me into the organization.
That's true.
And he was, I actually reported direct to him when I first joined. And I think we really resonated on that note, and that really Ted's really been the empowering force behind everything that I do here personally at Altium. So I really appreciate this podcast, the newsletter, AltiumLive. So we've had a blast doing some of that stuff and doing things really with the designer and engineer in mind. So that's been fun. Well, to your point, I think that's a good jumping off point. What we wanted to talk about today is Altium's identity. What, from your perspective, what is it that Altium stands for?
So I think you said it maybe in different words at the beginning of this, and I think Altium stands for the engineer, for the designer, for the people who actually have to do the work. And I think that's it's one of the things that makes us different from other software companies. We're not really thinking about things like, how do we, typical things that I've seen in other companies, like how do we sell higher into organizations? How do we get, executives to buy in so that we can do kind of, top-down, we can get top-down decisions to standardize on our software and things like that. The thing that I really noted about Altium and the culture of doing business and working with people here is that it's really focused on the guy who's got to do the work. Mm-hmm. And I think, so largely I believe that's the thing that we really stand for. And you'll probably remember that, I tell a story to a lot of people and pretty frequently about when I came here, trying to uncover what I felt was, or what was the fundamental kind of characteristics of Altium's brand and its identity. Mm-hmm. And it kind of rooted in a discussion I had with one of our board members, David Warren, who's since retired, but David was one of the first couple of guys into the company. And when they started the company, it wasn't a company yet. It was actually a couple of guys who were trying to build electronics. Mm-hmm. And at the time, and this goes back 30 years or so, CAD software, ECAD software in particular, it existed, but it was really expensive. It only ran on expensive high-end computers, and I think nobody in the room, yourself included, may remember those days, but I remember those days when you had to buy, Apollo workstations and big expensive machines.
Yeah,
it cost, the $50,000 this is back in the 80s, that was your barrier to entry. So it was a lot of money. And a lot of people who were involved in design didn't have access to that. They didn't have those budgets.
Right.
And these two guys were among those, and they actually set out to say, how could we have software like that for ourselves? Well, they decided to create it, and they wanted to create it in a way that it would be accessible not just for themselves, but for anybody who needed it. So they built it to run on PCs, and that was the genesis of Altium, right? That there were people out there who were doing and trying to do amazing things in the world of technology and engineering who didn't have access to all the tools, and they wanted to provide that access for themselves and for others. And for me and for the company, I mean, that's really a core part of what we stand for, right? Be for the engineer, but make that technology accessible, and make it accessible to people who need it, even when they don't have big budgets to work with. Sometimes they don't have any budgets to work with. So that, to me, that's really what Altium stands for.
Yeah, I think we have the best sort of origin story ever, especially because Dave Warren at the time was, I believe he was teaching at university. He said to me once that there was all these young, passionate people that have these great ideas and no access. And so he was kind of incensed by that. And that sort of filtered and still sort of lives in this company, this feeling of anyone who needs a tool should have it, because you can have a great idea at any age, at any phase. So let's give them tools. And I really love that really has, it's lasted long past the time that Dave Warren and these two guys sort of kicked this company off. It's really persisted. And I really like that. Yeah,
I think it's not just persisted because it's in the spirit of the employees who work here and everything, but I can tell you that we make our decisions on that basis. I mean, the basis of kind of being true to what we represent. And so we think about that. We think about, who are the underdogs and how do we empower them, and not kind of like leave them behind in pursuit of purely, making money in business. And we are a business. We're a commercial business, and of course we want to make money. Our shareholders expect us to make money. And on the other hand, we think that there's many ways to do that. And everyone may know, we have multiple products and kind of like multiple price points. That's one way. But we also try to think out of the box a little bit. And so, as an example, we have, I guess, one of our brands called Octopart, and where people can go and search for parts and so forth. And, you can do that as an engineer, and you don't pay to use that. It's actually kind of a seller pays model, right?
Right.
So when somebody buys parts after they've searched through Octopart, and, we may get a small fraction of that revenue, or people advertise on that site and we get a little bit of revenue from that, but we don't have to charge it to the user. And we think about, that's an example, but we are always thinking about how do we take a product like Upverter, for example, that actually was, before we acquired it, they charged a subscription fee. We made it free, with the intent that we would find ways to kind of indirectly monetize that in a seller pays kind of model.
Right.
Because we want to make that technology accessible to the maker community, to the kind of the inventors and creators of tomorrow who don't have money today.
Right.
So it's like I said, it's a core part of the decision-making process here, is how do we stay true to that vision of making technology accessible to everyone.
Yeah. It's just so refreshing to hear from an executive of a software company, I think. It's not something I think you hear a lot. Like, money does lead in many cases, but it's clear to me that there's a guiding principle behind that. That of course you have to be disciplined and answer to stockholders and do all those things, but you can do that in fresh and new ways. And
that's the key, right? Because I think, again, we need to be a sustainable business,
right,
or else the technology that we provide, we won't be here in 10 years or something.
Right.
And of course, we don't want that to happen.
No more podcasts, it'd be sad.
Right, but there are, interesting and different ways you can do it. It requires that you maybe, are willing to think outside of the conventional wisdom or the best practices and so forth.
Right.
And that's one of the things that I like about Altium, is that we really do try to break those norms and think about how we can do it differently, and just don't accept status quo. Don't accept best practice just because that's the way it's always been done.
Well, to me, it's innovation. And we try to build innovation into our software all the time. So we're building innovation into our model too, which I really love. So what would you say, would you say we have a defined mission?
Yeah.
I mean, beyond, well, you've kind of spelled out some of that, but like an actual defined mission.
Oh, absolutely. So I think everyone at Altium, we've refined this thinking in the way that we articulate it internally, but if you were to look at the things that we present externally, like when we do go to shareholder meetings, and in particular we do a technology day to our investor community, and we've done it the last several years in Australia, and that kind of, you can see the presentations on the web and so forth. But that's a real clue for anybody who really wants to know where Altium is going. If you look at those things directionally, that gives you a lot of guidance. And the thing that we say over and over and over again is that it's our mission to transform the electronics industry. And specifically what I mean by that is that creating electronics is more than just about the design process and the design tools. And so there's what I would kind of call it a value chain that's involved, right? You have people who think about the product and what's the intent of the product, and that kind of like breaks down into requirements for mechanical systems, for electronic systems, and all of that. But even then, the job's not over, because there have to be components that are supplied to that, or that are selected from that, and then found and acquired. There has to be a board that gets manufactured, the bare board. There has to be the assembly and fabrication of the full, system level board and everything. And sometimes it's multiple boards, and then it's all got to be put together. And so the job's not really done until everybody does that.
Right.
And the thing that is sort of striking about the electronics industry is that that's a really discontinuous process. We kind of like all think within our sort of
silos,
domains with our blinders on, and we believe that it's our it's going to sound a little silly, but it's got it's our self directed destiny to kind of change that. That's what we want to do. So the mission of the company is to really change, to transform the way that electronics are conceived, designed, manufactured, and delivered to the world. And we think there's lots of opportunities to do that a lot better.
Well, I know personally a lot of people have asked me about, why are you buying these, why? I remember Happy Holden last year saying, upverter. And so it's been because they think of us primarily as just a CAD provider.
Right.
Right? And so I think not a lot of people understand that we have our sights set much higher than that. Along those lines, I'd like to dig into that a little bit more, but before we do that, we are sort of AltiumLive will be here in San Diego in October, and we will be at least doing a marketing release then of showing what will be in Altium Designer 19.
We will.
And you mentioned to me that I had kind of thought, even just working here, you're down the hall for me, but my impression was that Altium 19 was going to be sort of an iterative release, and that Altium Designer 18 was massive. We changed the platform. We really revolutionized the tool in so many ways. So I thought, well, we're going to catch our breath, add a few little bells and whistles, and be on our way down the road. But you're telling me no, it's going to be big. And so can you, without giving away the secret sauce, tell us a little bit about sort of the intent?
Yeah, well, there's things that are still forming. It's kind of like the cake is still in the oven baking now. Yeah. So, I'm not necessarily ready to share a lot of detail, but here's what I will tell you about that. First of all, you're right. Altium Designer 19, it's not just another release, just like 18 wasn't just another release. And in fact, if I shorten it just for the sake of simplicity, AD 18, AD 19, and AD 20 are really a set of releases that are linked together in a fundamental way. And so And what we wanted to do with that series of releases was, in part, it kind of gets to this thing that I was talking about, kind of this idea of transforming the electronics industry. And specifically what we wanted to do with 18, 19, and 20 was to deliver incremental PCB design capabilities that would take us to places we hadn't been before. So, and specifically into high-speed design. And historically,
my
that hasn't,
subject.
I know you have lots of time invested into that, segment of the industry, and know lots of people there, and we think that's important that we can do better to support that. And in 80, 18, 19, and 20, that was one of the core kind of objectives there, was to help Altium to kind of grow up in terms of high-speed design capabilities. But it wasn't something that, it's kind of massive in terms of being able to do it. So it wasn't something we were able to deliver in a single release.
Right.
And in fact, when I think about high-speed design specifically, 8018 was kind of like delivering foundational capabilities that are required to do the kind of complex and large designs that typically we see in high speed.
Right.
So you didn't see particular high-speed capabilities there, not big ones yet anyways in 8018, but what you did see was that we moved from our old 32-bit platform to 64-bit.
Right.
We went from single-threaded activity to multi-threaded within the application, and things like that are kind of the plumbing that need to be there. That's right. They need to be there for us to be able to exercise those high-speed capabilities that we wanted to build in. With 8019, you'll start to see more of the capabilities now coming out. Won't be complete, but there will certainly be designs in the realm of high speed that people will start to be able to do, and it'll become visible that we're really going somewhere with that. And then 8020 will be the one where we move a lot towards a more completed set of capabilities for high speed. So that's one sort of key thing that I would say, is that certainly at AltiumLive, and as we come out with 8019, you will see real capabilities that start to bring us into that world. The other thing, though, is making real this idea of beginning to bring about industry transformation. And specifically, even at AltiumLive last year, one of the things we heard over and over again in the talks was people who were in board fabrication and assembly and manufacturing, and who think about DFM and things like that, who were saying over and over and over again, you guys out there in the design community don't think about us in the manufacturing world early enough and often enough. And conversely, we heard from people on the design side saying, kind of similar things back to manufacturing. So those two worlds have been, historically siloed, as you said. And
it comes up, I cannot tell you how often this comes up in this podcast series. It's a persistent problem. Everybody knows it's there.
Yeah, it is a huge problem, and I think and one of the things that I'm really excited about with 8019 is that you're going to see some things that are fairly dramatic in terms of helping to bring those two worlds together, to where people who are doing design will be in contact with people who are involved in manufacturing while they're designing. And the ultimate end game for that is that you would imagine a world where when you are doing design, you don't only have design constraints to think about, but the manufacturing constraints are things that guide what you can and can't do, and how you create that, so that you avoid those kind of like downstream not exactly mistakes, but those downstream things that you didn't think about that cause design turnbacks and spins that are really not needed, right?
They're not needed, and it costs so much money and time.
Yeah, so 8019 is going to be, I think, it's going to be really impactful and kind of transformative in the way that design and designers and people in the manufacturing side of the business will be able to work together. So I don't want to spill too much of that, but it's going to be, I honestly think this is, in many ways, a bigger, more transformative thing than 8018 was, which was pretty huge. for us at least, in seeing our tool
when
transform.
When you said that to me, I'm like, wait, what? I was shocked when you said that to me about a week ago. I was like, wait, I work here and I don't know. And I talk to developers regularly, and I think because I get just little glimpses of pieces, I'm not seeing the overarching, where I think you, from where you sit, you're getting the overarching perspective.
Maybe so, but like I said, I think the key thing here is that it will really be something that changes the way that it changes the way we think about CAD and what we should expect from our CAD tools.
Which is great. I've said for many years that the power of CAD has actually been problematic, because if you are not 30, 40 years into this industry, you can get so much power in that tool. It's like, I was saying to someone, I go, there needs to be a feedback from the tool that says, no, stop, dummy. There is no place that says, no, stop, this is a bad idea.
Right.
Those cores don't match. Those holes are too small. Those vias are, there's,
right.
Of course we can put in, parameters and things that help them design well, but so to hear that coming together would just be life-changing. So that's very exciting.
Yeah, and like I said, it's not something that I think we won't realize that full vision at 8019.
Right.
It'll be, again, this combination of 18, 19, and 20. You'll be able to see now with 8019 how those things kind of link together, and we'll be telling people, we'll disclose our roadmap for 8020 so people can see how that whole thing plays out. But there's going to be a lot there, and it will be enough to change the way that designers and manufacturers are working together. It will, change more. It'll change in even more dramatic ways as we are able to deliver everything through those 3 releases.
Right.
But there's going to be enough there that I think it's really exciting to think about and talk about. And I guess the other thing for me, or maybe not the other thing, but on a related note, I remember last year at AltiumLive how all those conversations seemed to be centered around standards. And so, couldn't we come up with like a single standard for how data is represented and so forth? And
that is a hot topic.
Standardization, I just have to say, standardization is such a hard thing to do, to get everybody within an industry to do that. And I think the reality is that standardization isn't the answer. Standardization is a solution that people kind of assume is the right way to solve the problem. So we tend to kind of like think about how could we solve this problem? If the problem is that people just don't work together, and when I design, I don't end up with something that's manufacturable until I go through many spins,
right,
as an example. That's the problem, right? And then the solution is just to make it work, right? As a designer
right,
or as somebody in manufacturing, do I really care about standardization?
Right.
No, I don't. But what I wanted to have happen is that it just works.
Right.
And I don't have to think about it. I don't have to do anything extra, nor does the person on the other side of the wall that we're throwing things back and forth over. We just want it to work.
Right.
And that's the approach that we're taking. And again, you'll see it gets to what you were saying, why do we acquire these companies, for example?
Right.
So we did just recently a small acquisition of a company called PCB NG. NG is for a next generation. And that's a company that does board assembly and manufacturing. And they do it on small scales, so the idea is that they do low volume, high variety, kind of high mix kind of designs. So when people want to build prototypes and so forth, and their whole mission has been to really change, to be able to create a manufacturing line where the designers can know everything about it, so they kind of design in those constraints from the start, which is very aligned with the idea that I was talking about and where Altium has been thinking. And now if you rewind back, a couple of years ago, we acquired a company called Siva. And Siva was really focused on a couple things. One was to have a bill of material that was smarter and smarter in the sense that you understood straight away what was the life cycle state of the components that you select and the parts that you select. Are those things even available anymore? So you don't use, so you don't select and design in things that you couldn't even buy if you wanted to. And then there's the notion
which
of
happens frequently, by the way.
It does happen frequently, right?
It's such a headache.
And SIVA, the other thing that they were really focused on was to understand those manufacturing constraints as well. And so there's kind of this nice convergence of thinking where the SIVA guys were trying to solve that problem, PCB and G guys were trying to solve that problem, and Altium is trying to solve that problem. And so bringing them all together now gives us the way, a way that we can say, how do we make it just work? And so having that small manufacturing company gives us a way that we can prove this out, we can make it happen, having sort of like full access to everything in that facility and on their line, and as well having the people on the side of thinking about the supply chain and the bill of material and the design side. We can do all of those things. And so we don't intend to kind of like make PCB and G into some big volume manufacturer. It's never going to be Foxconn, nor do we want it to be, but we want to make it just work. And once we prove it there, then we can take it to all manufacturers. And that's the idea. And so we'll again start to give you a glimpse of that, and more than a glimpse, we'll give actual real capabilities at 8019 that will allow people to begin to solve that problem, or not even solve it, just make it work.
Right. Just make it work. Huh.
So 8019 in my mind is a huge step forward.
Well, I'm very excited. So I'm going to put a pin in our conversation real quick and just let our listeners know that all of, sometimes people just think of us being the creators of Altium Designer and don't realize, and we've sort of been acquiring these companies. So we will have an area at AltiumLive in San Diego and in Munich, if you're able to join us, where all of those brands will be joining us. I'm hoping to put them in an area that I'm calling Altium Alley. So we'll have Upverter, SIVA, PCB&G, and so we can start to see how this all fits together.
Yeah.
So I'm excited about that. So let's talk a little bit about AltiumLive, since we are rolling out 8019 at that time, at least to give a sneak peek of it. You and I worked very closely together and sort of had a shared passion for the idea. It was Altium Live, our first ever users conference, was really Ted's brainchild, and then I was brought on board, and then we worked closely together, and then it took a village. It took an Altium village to put on that users conference. So can we talk a little bit about why Altium Live? Why did we decide as a company to begin doing a users conference, and sort of what is our intention behind that? Because we want to sell more software?
Well, of course we always want to sell more software.
Of course we do.
There's no doubt about that. But
obviously
I think
being very facetious.
Yeah, but if I come back to the beginning of our conversation, I mentioned this notion that if you do the right thing for your customers, that they support you, and that good things happen as a result of that. And I think Altium Live is it's really built on that idea. So we wanted to create a forum in which our users, but more than that, people in the industry could come together to kind of talk about and collaborate on how do we solve the challenges that we face as an industry. So the fact that we had manufacturers there and manufacturers reps and everything else, as well as so these are people that don't know Altium Designer. If they saw it, they wouldn't know whether it was Altium Designer or another tool per se, possibly. But they're involved in the industry, and they're relevant, right, to the way that we do design and so forth, as well as all the design people. So we wanted a place where our users could come and they could learn, and they could get better at their craft, and they could connect with one another. So I think, Judy, you came up with the idea that it was about, connect learn and inspire.
Right.
And that's really the idea, right? I mean, in terms of connect, it's always good to be able to meet your peers, to talk with your peers who you face, common challenges with, and talk about how do you overcome those, how do you approach them, how does your company support you in those things. Those are always really valuable conversations. And so that's, I think, what the connect part is all about. Learning is pretty obvious. People always want to learn, how do I get better? And that's both in terms of using tools, but more than that, it's the becoming better as an engineer. So a lot of the curriculum, if you will, that was associated with that, and the sessions that we had, they weren't about how do I use Altium Designer. They
Not
were
at all.
how do I solve these challenges from an engineering perspective. Even
what are
sort
better
of like,
routing practices?
right, sans tools
Right.
and tool speak, or specific tool speak.
Right.
Right. It's like, how do I do these things? So the learning part of it was really important, and inspire. Obviously, we if we're going to transform the industry, we want to bring together the people, the stakeholders in the industry, who are likewise, facing these bigger challenges, not just how do I design better, but how do I design in a way that I know it can be manufactured, and that manufacturers don't have to go back and completely recast the bill of materials and force me to change the design, and how do I ensure that these parts are actually available and all of that. But it's really, again, about inspiring the community to think about how we solve these problems of the industry, the fact that it's it is sort of discontinuous in terms of that flow and so forth. And we've got a lot of ideas at Altium about how we solve that, but we definitely don't have all the answers, and nor would we want to try to solve those in absence of all the thought leaders and practitioners in the industry, right? So I think that's the third part of it, is really to bring together those leading practitioners and thought leaders from the industries to say, how do we take our whole industry forward in a way that I don't want this to sound a little too trivial, but we talk about IoT. How do we deliver 50 billion devices by 2025 or whatever it is?
Whatever their numbers,
those numbers. But I think that there's lots of places where electronics are important, even in absence of IoT. But the smarter we make our world, the better that's going to be, the more ability we have to solve some of the big picture problems in the world using electronics and engineering and so forth. And that's only going to happen when we all come together to figure out how do we do all this better and more effectively.
I loved the convergence at our event. It was like magical to see, and such spirited conversations between fabricators, and even our keynotes, right? I remember one of the keynotes in Munich saying something about fabrication, and then our friend Julia was like, wait a minute, and them having this really honest, challenging, almost debate, right? But it was so beneficial. I think everybody was really, empowered by having that really those frank conversations and really learning from each other. A thing that I really like, Ted, is that if you look across North America, at least, well, I would even say Europe, how many events are there for designers? I mean, for printed circuit board designers or engineers that are, what events are out there? We have PCB West, which has some good tracks. Design Con is chip and board level. PCB Carolinas, I can think. Electronica,
Embedded World.
So there's just a handful.
Right.
But is there any that just focuses kind of exclusively and puts the designer front and center? No, they've kind of lost. They don't really have a place. And what I love about AltiumLive is that gets to be sort of the center of the conversation, but shoulder to shoulder with all the other stakeholders, right? So it's like they get their own party, where they can just dig in and get such deep learning, not only from really incredible thought leaders like our keynotes, but also from each other.
Right.
Which
Yeah, we saw that happening a lot, right? And
yeah.
You can see it just if you go and even on the website for AltiumLive and you look at last year's recorded sessions and so forth. You see that pretty clearly. It was pretty striking, and it's my hope is that over time people will actually start to see this event as something it's not an Altium event, it's their event.
Right.
And that's the spirit behind it, frankly, is that we the same as with products and solving these problems and everything. There's no way that Altium can do it on its own, or any one company could do it on its own. We have to do it as a community. So I see AltiumLive as a community, and I hope it grows, and I hope that the control of the agenda and the content and all of that kind of stuff stays with the users, the designers, and the people in the industry who are actually doing the work.
Yes.
That's my vision for it.
Yes.
That it's not us and it's not about our software,
right.
but it's really just about us using the fact that we have lots of customers and users and so forth as a way to using our position to help bring them together.
Right. Absolutely. And I've shared with people that you don't need to be an Altium user to come to this event.
No, that's true.
And it's like no one really believes that, but it really is true. You could come using another mainstream tool, and you would have to endure us rolling out the new release of Altium Designer for 45 minutes.
Right.
Other than that, you will just be getting good learning, meeting with other designers. So,
yeah, if I go by memory, right, we had something on the order of I don't know, a dozen main stage presentations or so, and of those, 2 of them were by Altium people.
Right.
And the rest were not. We had probably, I think, 24 actual learning sessions that were, kind of focused on training and developing skills and so forth. And of those, I think maybe 4 or so were really focused on Altium Designer. And sure, we could show. What we typically did was show, how after you spent the bulk of the time learning how you attack a problem, you'd show how that could be done in Altium Designer. But it wasn't about solving it with Altium Designer. It was about solving it. So and I'm kind of like proud of that. I'm proud that we didn't make it a place where you just come and hear about Altium and we market to you and sell to you and so forth. It's not about that.
Well, you really are the champion of that, and I am your proud sidekick in that regards, because honestly I didn't know any company would let somebody like me do this, but it's being driven from the top. So I love that you're kind of jealously holding on to that. This is about community.
Right.
Dang it. So for those of you who are listening, please know that you are welcome to join us at AltiumLive 2018 in San Diego, October 3rd through 5th. And the website is up, registration's open, and because the attendees asked us to last year, we've added a full university day where there's more tool training, because people actually complained a little bit that we didn't train them enough on our tool. So kudos to us, but we again didn't want to mingle that into our main program, so we set aside 160 spots on the front end where we will teach you in the tool and keep the rest of it rather tool agnostic. And then also in parallel, our friend Lee Ritchie has agreed to teach a full day on high-speed design, which will be a real treat. And all of this, the price is silly low, and it's in beautiful San Diego. So there's just no downside to it as far as I can see. So we're all looking forward to seeing you there.
Absolutely.
I wrote a note here, Ted, and I'm just going to ask you about it, and we may have already covered it, but you had mentioned something to me about Altium X. Was that about the transformation part, or X factor, sort of?
Well, that's a little bit of an internal code name right now for this the projects surrounding this connection between Altium Designer 19 and manufacturing.
Okay.
So we've kind of covered that.
Yeah. Okay.
And so you won't see a product called Altium X, but
yeah.
As often happens when products and projects kind of come to life, they don't have a brand associated with them, and we look for clever little ways to talk about them internally before we know that
right.
people can kind of rally around and know kind of what we're talking about. And Altium X was that for this project, at least for a while. And we've talked about different ways to brand it and talk about it and so forth. But it's really, the key thing is it's a part of Altium Designer. This isn't going to be a separate product.
Right.
And actually, I will say that's one of the things that's interesting and I think valuable about Altium Designer is that it's always been this idea of that it's not kind of like module by module by module, but it's one thing that gives you the capabilities that you need. And where there are exceptions, it's because we have partners involved and they want to know how much of their product is going out and so forth. But largely, if it's Altium, if it's things that we develop internally, we make it a part of that product.
Right.
So it's really simple to know what it is you want. You want that one thing, Altium Designer. It's really simple to buy it. There's one price, and it's hopefully really simple to work with us and do business with us. And that notion of, we call it easy to.
Right.
But that's when you get to the spirit of Altium and our identity and everything, I think that's another piece of it that I didn't talk about before. But it's another part of it that we think is really important, is that we just make it easy for people to know what they're dealing with, who they're dealing with, and how they work with us and so forth. Even how they use the product. We really try to work hard to make everything easy to do.
Right. And I think we're living up to that. We're not perfect. We've got lots of growing to do.
That's true.
Always. But when because I have the privilege of sponsoring teams and different things as part of my job, often people will come to me and go, oh my gosh, this was so easy to install. It only took me, I was up and running in an hour instead of half a day or whatever. So I sort of hear that feedback. So it makes me proud to be part of this team. So Ted, thanks so much. I know you're such a busy guy and you're spinning a few dozen plates at all times. So thanks for taking the time to sit down with us and share with the people who are listening to podcasts.
Well, thanks for giving me the chance to do that. And I hope that I was able to give enough insight and something interesting and exciting for people to think about. I'd love to have people come to AltiumLive and hear more about what we're doing, and also hear from their peers in the community. But like I said, we're really excited about kind of the journey that we're on, this whole transformation of electronics, and we are now starting to feel like we're starting to see light at the end of that tunnel, and we've got a long ways to go, but there's enough light there that I think with 8019 and at AltiumLive, that's going to really start to be exposed in ways that will stop people in their tracks. And so I'm excited about that.
I'm so excited about that. And I can't even know about some of this stuff, you guys. So we'll all learn together, I guess, at Altium Live. So I hope you will join us. Thank you so much for listening to our podcast. I do encourage you to register for Altium Live coming up in October in San Diego. We should be in Munich, I believe, the mid-January. We're just locking that down now, so bear with us while we get that locked down. And remember, whether you use our tools or not, you're more than welcome, and we would love to have you just join us and rub shoulders and be part of the community. So thank you again, Ted, for joining us today, and thank you for listening or watching, and we look forward to being with you next time. Until then, always stay on track.